A federal court just handed Donald Trump a major legal victory, one that not only caught Democrats off guard, but may reshape how presidential authority is defined moving forward. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, often described as one of America's most liberal benches, has ruled in Trump's favor, giving him the power to deploy the National Guard in Portland, Oregon. And that decision, it sent shockwaves through Washington. Because it's not just about troops, it's about who gets to make the rules in moments of chaos. Let's break down what this ruling really means, why Democrats are panicking, and what happens next for America's future. Now, before we dive deeper, let me set the scene clearly. What we're talking about here is a 2-to-1 ruling from a 3-judge panel on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. This court lifted an earlier order that had blocked the deployment of around 200 National Guard soldiers to Portland. Think about that for a moment. A court that has a reputation for leaning left, for pushing back against conservative policies, just ruled in favor of a decision made by Donald Trump. That alone tells you this isn't just politics as usual. This is about the fundamental structure of how our government works, about whether the President of the United States, regardless of party, has the constitutional authority to protect federal property and enforce federal law when local governments refuse to do so. And the answer, at least from this appellate court, is yes, he does. But why does this matter so much? Why should you, as someone who's lived through decades of American political life, care about a court ruling in Portland? Because this case isn't really about Portland. It's about precedent. It's about whether the executive branch can be second-guessed by lower courts every time a decision is unpopular with one side or the other. It's about whether the rule of law still means something when the political winds change direction. And here's the thing. When you look at what was happening on the ground in Portland, the ruling starts to make a lot more sense. So before we understand why this ruling matters so much, we need to go back to what was really happening on the ground. Portland has been a flashpoint for years now. Demonstrations, protests, and increasingly aggressive confrontations around federal buildings, especially facilities run by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Over several weeks leading up to the court case, there were large gatherings outside the ICE detention center. Protesters held signs, chanted slogans, and in some cases, clashed directly with federal agents. Now, let me be clear. Peaceful protest is a bedrock right in this country. It's protected by the Constitution, and it should be. But what was happening in Portland went beyond peaceful assembly. There were reports of vandalism, of fireworks and projectiles thrown at federal officers, of attempts to breach the security perimeter around the facility. And here's the critical part. Local law enforcement, the Portland Police Department, wasn't responding to calls for assistance from federal agencies. Think about that. Federal officers tasked with protecting a federal building and the people inside it called for backup, and no one came. Why? Because the local government had instructed police not to cooperate with ICE operations. It was a political decision rooted in disagreement over immigration policy. But the result was that federal property and federal employees were left vulnerable. So the question became, if the state can't or won't protect its own federal buildings, who can? That's the question the judges were asking, and it's the question that changed everything. The Trump administration argued that the president has the statutory authority under a specific section of federal law to federalize the National Guard when regular forces are unable to execute the laws of the United States. In other words, when the normal system breaks down, the president can step in.
And in this case, the Ninth Circuit agreed. The majority opinion was careful and detailed. It didn't just say Trump can do whatever he wants. It said that after reviewing all the evidence, statements from federal officials, reports of violence and obstruction, the documented lack of local support, the president's decision fell within a range of honest judgment. That phrase is important. It means the court isn't saying Trump's decision was the only possible choice. It's saying it was a reasonable choice, grounded in the facts, and therefore not something a lower court has the authority to block. One of the judges on the panel, appointed by Trump himself, wrote that he was trying to figure out how a district court could question whether the president's assessment of executing the laws was right or wrong. And honestly, that's a fair point. Judges aren't executives. They don't have intelligence briefings. They don't manage federal agencies. Their job is to interpret the law, not to manage crises in real time. And when a president acts within his legal authority, even if people disagree with the decision, courts shouldn't be stepping in to micromanage. Now, there was a dissenting opinion. One judge, appointed during the Clinton administration, argued that the protests in Portland were small and non-disruptive in the weeks before Trump called up the troops. She believed the deployment wasn't justified. But here's the thing. She was outvoted. And in the American legal system, the majority rules. So the deployment stands, at least for now. And here's where it gets really interesting. Even some voices on the left, people who have spent years criticizing Trump, are quietly admitting that he was within his rights. There was a moment on MSNBC where a legal analyst broke down the ruling on air, and she didn't spin it. She didn't try to dismiss it. She explained clearly and accurately that the president has the constitutional authority to deploy the National Guard in situations like this, and that the Ninth Circuit's decision was legally sound. You could see the surprise on the host's face because this isn't the narrative anyone expected. When the facts become undeniable, even political lines start to blur. And that's what's happening here. People who oppose Trump on policy, who disagree with his tone or his tactics, are looking at this case and saying, yeah, he was right to do this. Not because they like him, but because the law is the law. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. This victory didn't come out of nowhere. It's the result of years of strategy and a pattern that's starting to repeat itself. Over the past several months, Trump has won a series of legal battles on immigration, border enforcement, and executive authority. Courts across the country, including some that lean progressive, are ruling in favor of the administration's actions. Why? Because the legal arguments are grounded in the Constitution and in federal statutes that have been on the books for decades. Think of it like physics. You can resist gravity for a moment, but sooner or later, the fundamentals pull everything back into balance. That's what's happening in the judiciary right now. Judges are shifting away from activism and back toward constitutional literalism. They're asking, what does the law actually say, rather than, what do I wish the law said? And when you apply that standard, a lot of Trump's policies hold up. This is a profound shift, and it's one that a lot of people didn't see coming. For years, the expectation was that liberal courts would block Trump at every turn, and for a while they tried. But the Supreme Court has consistently reversed those lower court rulings, establishing precedents that limit the ability of district judges to issue nationwide injunctions or to second-guess executive decisions on national security. And now, appellate courts, like the Ninth Circuit, are following that lead. So what does this mean for the country? It means that the legal landscape is changing. It means that executive power, when exercised within constitutional limits, is being respected again. And it means that Democrats, who have relied on the courts to stop policies they don't like, are running out of options. And that brings us to the Democrats' dilemma: losing control of the narrative. Because here's the uncomfortable truth for progressives. Their strategy of defying federal authority is backfiring. Cities like Portland and Chicago have spent years positioning themselves as sanctuaries, refusing to cooperate with immigration enforcement, instructing local police not to respond to ICE calls. They believe they were taking a moral stand, but legally and politically, it's falling apart. When local governments refuse to uphold federal law, they create a power vacuum. And that vacuum has consequences. Federal agencies can't do their jobs. Public safety is compromised, and eventually the executive branch steps in with force. That's exactly what happened in Portland. The city's refusal to provide police support gave the Trump administration the justification it needed to deploy the National Guard. In other words, Democrats handed Trump the win.
And now similar cases are playing out in other cities. In Chicago, for example, there's been a legal challenge to National Guard deployment around ICE facilities. But there's a key difference. The Chicago Police Department has been more cooperative. They've responded to calls, made arrests, and maintained order. So the legal case there is weaker for the administration. The outcome might be different, but the principle remains the same. If you refuse to enforce the law, don't be surprised when someone else does it for you. Democrats are also facing a deeper problem, a credibility crisis. Because it's not just about losing in court, it's about losing the trust of the American people. Polls show that a majority of Americans, including many independents and even some Democrats, support stronger border enforcement and believe that immigration laws should be followed. When Democratic leaders take positions that seem to prioritize ideology over public safety, they alienate voters. And the media isn't helping them. For years, mainstream outlets amplified every court ruling against Trump, every protest, every accusation. But when Trump wins, when the courts rule in his favor, when his policies are validated by data or by events, those same outlets go quiet. It's selective coverage, and people notice. You can tell who's winning by who the media tries hardest to ignore. And speaking of ignoring reality, what I'm about to share next just shows how deep the denial goes. Because while the legal victories stack up, while the courts validate Trump's authority, and while public opinion shifts, some people are still living in an alternate version of events. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the recent media appearances of former White House press secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. Now, if you remember, Jean-Pierre served as the face of the Biden administration for years. She stood at that podium day after day, answering questions from reporters, defending policy decisions, and assuring the American people that President Biden was sharp, engaged, and fully in command. But after Biden's disastrous debate performance and his eventual decision not to seek re-election, questions started mounting. How could his inner circle not have seen the decline? Why didn't anyone speak up? Jean-Pierre recently went on a book tour, and the interviews have been uncomfortable to say the least. On CBS, the hosts pressed her directly. You were in the inner circle. You saw the president nearly every day. How could you say you never saw any cognitive decline? And her answer? She stumbled.
She deflected. She said she saw someone who was engaged, who understood policy, who challenged his staff on the details. But she couldn't explain why so many Americans, watching the same president on television, saw something completely different. At one point, she claimed she didn't really see Biden until after the debate, even though she was on Air Force One with him on the way there. Think about that. The press secretary traveling with the president to one of the most important events of the campaign, and she's saying she didn't see him. It strains credibility, and the interviewers knew it. You could see it in their faces, the polite skepticism, the unspoken question, "Are you really expecting us to believe this?" And then there was her appearance on a political podcast, where a Democratic commentator confronted her even more bluntly. He said, "Let's be real. Biden didn't talk to the press nearly as much as Trump does. He wasn't accessible, he wasn't doing events, and when he did, it wasn't very good." Jean-Pierre tried to push back, insisting that Biden spoke to the American people regularly, that he traveled, that he was engaged. But the host wasn't having it. He kept pressing. He didn't talk often, and when he did, it wasn't effective. Let's just be honest about his performance. It was an extraordinary moment. Here was a Democrat, someone who presumably voted for Biden, who supported his policies, directly challenging the official narrative. And Jean-Pierre had no good answer. She couldn't defend the record because the record speaks for itself. Biden held fewer press conferences than any modern president. He rarely took unscripted questions. His public appearances were carefully managed and often brief. And when things went off script, like at that debate, the results were damaging. So why does this matter in the context of Trump's court victory? Because it's all part of the same story. It's about credibility. It's about whether the people in power are being honest with you. And right now, she deflected. She said she saw someone who was engaged, who understood policy, who challenged his staff on the details.
But she couldn't explain why so many Americans, watching the same president on television, saw something completely different. At one point, she claimed she didn't really see Biden until after the debate, even though she was on Air Force One with him on the way there. Think about that. The press secretary traveling with the president to one of the most important events of the campaign, and she's saying she didn't see him. It strains credibility, and the interviewers knew it. You could see it in their faces. The polite skepticism, the unspoken question, are you really expecting us to believe this? And then there was her appearance on a political podcast where a Democratic commentator confronted her even more bluntly. He said, let's be real, Biden didn't talk to the press nearly as much as Trump does. He wasn't accessible. He wasn't doing events. And when he did, it wasn't very good. Jean-Pierre tried to push back, insisting that Biden spoke to the American people regularly, that he traveled, that he was engaged. But the host wasn't having it. He kept pressing. He didn't talk often, and when he did, it wasn't effective. Let's just be honest about his performance. It was an extraordinary moment. Here was a Democrat, someone who presumably voted for Biden, who supported his policies, directly challenging the official narrative. And Jean-Pierre had no good answer. She couldn't defend the record because the record speaks for itself. Biden held fewer press conferences than any modern president. He rarely took unscripted questions. His public appearances were carefully managed and often brief. And when things went off script, like at that debate, the results were damaging. So why does this matter in the context of Trump's court victory? Because it's all part of the same story. It's about credibility. It's about whether the people in power are being honest with you. And right now, Democrats are facing a trust collapse, not just with Republicans, but with their own base. People who want to believe, who want to support progressive policies, are looking at moments like Jean-Pierre's interviews and thinking, if they lied about this, what else aren't they telling us? And that erosion of trust has real consequences. It weakens the party's ability to mobilize voters. It undermines their arguments on other issues. And it makes it much harder to mount effective opposition when Trump does something they disagree with. Because if your credibility is shot, your outrage rings hollow. Now, let's zoom out for a moment and talk about what this court ruling really means. Not just for Portland, not just for Trump, but for the country as a whole. Because at its core, this case is about two things: national security and sovereignty. Those are big words, but the concepts are simple. National security means keeping Americans safe from threats, both foreign and domestic. Sovereignty means that the United States, as a nation, has the right and the responsibility to control its borders, enforce its laws, and protect its institutions. When local governments refuse to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, they're not just making a policy statement, they're undermining sovereignty. They're saying, we don't care what the federal law is, we're going to do things our way. And in the short term, that might feel principled, but in the long term, it creates chaos. Because if every city and state can pick and choose which federal laws to follow, you don't have a country anymore. You have 50 different countries, all with different rules. And the security risks are real. Just recently, federal authorities arrested an individual in Louisiana who had entered the country illegally during the Biden administration. And according to the charges, this person allegedly participated in the October 7th terror attacks on Israel, one of the deadliest days for Jewish people since the Holocaust.
He applied for a visa in Egypt, lied on his application, and was led into the United States. He then moved from Oklahoma to Louisiana, living freely until the Trump administration tracked him down. Now, we don't know all the details yet. The case will go through the courts and evidence will be presented. But the fact that someone with alleged ties to terrorism was able to enter the country and remain here for months is deeply troubling. It underscores the importance of vetting, of enforcement, and of cooperation between federal and local authorities. Because when the system breaks down, dangerous people slip through the cracks. This is why Trump has been so adamant about mass deportations, about securing the border, about making sure that federal immigration law is actually enforced. It's not about cruelty. It's not about targeting any particular group. It's about ensuring that the people who come into this country are doing so legally, and that those who pose a threat are identified and removed. That's not radical. That's basic governance. And here's where the double standard becomes impossible to ignore. When Trump took these positions during his campaign, the media portrayed him as extreme, as fear-mongering, as un-American. But when an alleged terrorist is arrested on American soil, when protests turn violent, when federal buildings are attacked, suddenly those concerns don't seem so extreme anymore, do they? Yet the coverage is minimal. The headlines are buried. The narrative doesn't fit. So the story gets ignored. You can see the pattern clearly. When Trump faced legal challenges, when district judges issued injunctions against his policies, it was front-page news. Analysts debated for hours. It was treated as a constitutional crisis. But when those rulings are overturned, when appellate courts and the Supreme Court say, actually, the president was within his rights, the media moves on. There's no follow-up, no acknowledgement, no correction of the record. This isn't journalism, it's advocacy. And people are tired of it. They're tired of being told what to think instead of being given the facts and allowed to decide for themselves. They're tired of selective outrage, of narratives that shift depending on who's in power. And that exhaustion is showing up in polling, in viewership numbers, in the growing distrust of mainstream institutions. Which brings us to the Democrat credibility crisis we talked about earlier, but now in sharper focus. Because it's not just about Jeffrey's awkward interviews or Biden's low approval ratings. It's about a party that has lost its ability to set the agenda. For years, Democrats controlled the narrative. They had the media on their side. The courts often ruled in their favor, and they could mobilize grassroots energy around resistance and opposition. But now, that's falling apart. The courts are ruling against them. The media is losing credibility, and the grassroots energy, it's fading. Look at the so-called No Kings protests that were supposed to flood the streets and shut down cities across America. They flopped. Turnout was weak, the rallies were small, and in some cases, the organizers themselves were exposed people with histories of inciting violence, with criminal records, with ties to extremist groups. When your movement is led by people who call for violence, who have been arrested for assault, who openly advocate for chaos, you lose the moral high ground. And Democrats are learning that the hard way, because voters, especially older voters like you, remember what real protest movements looked like.
You remember the civil rights marches, the anti-war demonstrations, the movements that were grounded in principle and discipline. What's happening now isn't that. It's performance. It's theater. And it's not working. So what does this all mean for October and beyond? Let's think practically about the political landscape. Trump just won a major legal victory that reinforces his core message: law and order, strong executive leadership, and a willingness to stand up to opposition. That message resonates, not because Trump is perfect, no one is, but because people remember what it felt like when there was clarity, when there was strength, when the government functioned with purpose. Voters may disagree with his tone. They may not like his tweets or his style, but they remember what order felt like. They remember a president who didn't back down, who fought for his policies, and who delivered results. And when they compare that to the last few years, the chaos at the border, the rising crime in cities, the international instability, they start to think, maybe we were better off than we realized. And here's the thing Democrats really don't want to hear. This court ruling isn't just a legal victory. It's a signal of what's coming. It's a sign that the system, for all its flaws, is self-correcting, that checks and balances work, that when courts follow the law instead of politics, outcomes start to align with constitutional principles. And that momentum builds. One ruling leads to another, precedents get set, and suddenly the opposition is playing defense instead of offense. Now let me be clear. This doesn't mean Trump or any president should have unchecked power. That's not what this ruling says, and that's not what I'm arguing. What it means is that when a president acts within his constitutional authority, based on facts, with proper legal grounding,
Courts should respect that. They shouldn't be second-guessing every decision based on political preferences, because that's not the role of the judiciary. And for those of you watching who worry about government overreach, who value freedom and limited government, this is actually good news, because it reaffirms that the system has structure, that there are rules, and that those rules apply to everyone. Presidents can't do whatever they want, but they also can't be blocked in every turn by judges who happen to disagree with them. There's a balance, and we're seeing that balance reassert itself. So as we wrap up, let me leave you with this thought. What we're witnessing right now isn't just about Portland or the National Guard or one court ruling. It's about whether America's institutions, our courts, our laws, our constitutional framework still function the way they were designed to. And the answer, at least in this case, is yes, they do. You don't have to like every decision. You don't have to agree with every policy, but you can appreciate when the rule of law is respected again. When judges apply the Constitution as written, when the system corrects itself instead of spiraling further into dysfunction. That's what happened this week. A liberal court ruled in favor of a conservative president, not because they liked him, but because the law was on his side. And that's something worth celebrating regardless of where you stand politically. Because if the law means something, if the Constitution still matters, then we still have a country. We still have a foundation to build on. And that foundation, tested and strained as it's been, is holding. If you found this breakdown helpful, don't forget to like this video. It really helps more people hear the truth that the mainstream often hides. And if you want to stay informed, not just entertained, subscribe right now and join this growing community of thinkers who still believe in facts over fear. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree that the courts are finally starting to wake up? I read what you write, and your voice matters.